Great. Well, yeah, take it away whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alys Laver. I'm the site manager at Steart Marshes, and I've been lucky enough to be at Steart for 9 years. So this is quite a monumental image that I like to open my presentations with, because this was actually the first ever tidal inundation of the site itself, which happened in September 2014. So on the east side of the slide, you've got the River Parrett, and then on sort of the northern side, you've got the Bristol Channel sort of Severn Estuary. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about WWT, the creation of Steart, and then how we use Steart as a demonstration site for all the amazing benefits wetlands provide for people and wildlife. So next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. So yeah, I work for WWT, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Our speciality is obviously wetlands, so we look to protect, restore and create healthy wetlands, and we do this all over the world. So it all started on the banks of the River Severn, funnily enough, in Gloucestershire, in 1946, where Peter Scott sort of set up WWT at Slimbridge. So Steart's quite a different model for WWT. It's the first free entry, open access site with no captive birds, no centre. So it's very much sort of open to people, and we use it as a demonstration site to show people, well, one, what can be done elsewhere, anywhere in the world, but also sort of looking at research, gaining evidence for wetlands and the benefits they provide. But we also use it a lot in policy. So we've got people who sit in government trying to rally together with other NGOs and trying to bring around change in policy. So we like to think that we do complete conservation, sort of working across government, business and sort of wider civil society. So next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. So I always think it's quite important to explain where it actually is. So those of you who aren't aware, we are right down on the Severn Estuary, and then we are like this. Well, Steart actually stands for tail, so we're sort of a tail that sticks out into the estuary, and as I am sure many of you are aware, the Severn Estuary obviously has a huge amount of designations, SACs, SPAs, triple SIs, Ramsar designations, and that's all connected with the precious habitat and the wintering birds that use the area. And it's also a really exciting, dynamic part of the country with the second largest tidal range in the world. So it's been quite funny working with scientists who predominantly on the southeast of the country, where they've got sort of 2-meter tidal ranges, because it blows their mind a little bit. Next slide, please, Ellie. So first and foremost, I'd like to explain why Steart even came about. So a lot of people think that we're connected with Hinkley Sea and mitigation for that. People still believe that we were created to protect Bridgewater from flooding. So neither of those are true. The reason that Steart Marshes came about first and foremost was a habitat creation scheme. So the Environment Agency has to continue maintenance of hard sea defences all around the Severn Estuary. And in that maintenance, where the sea isn't allowed to come in any further, what we're seeing is with climate change, rising sea levels, if you look at that top image, we're actually starting to lose the upper marsh section of our salt marsh habitat. So this is something called coastal squeeze. So within that practice, as the Environment Agency is protecting businesses and homes, they also needed to compensate for the loss of internationally important habitat all around the Severn Estuary. So that is why it came about. So what we do, the management alignment part, is where you can see where the original seawall was, which was along the River Parrett, that sort of yellow block. We've actually set back those sea defences and created a huge area that we let the sea into, and we're now seeing the salt marsh develop. So next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. So the Steart Peninsula, it's been under the watchful eye of many NGOs and government organisations for over 20 years, and it was identified as potentially a site large enough to deliver the Environment Agency's objectives. Next slide, please, Sally. And the reason for this is a really important message, is there was absolutely no compulsory purchasing. And if you look at this image, this is in 1981, and this is when the River Parrett, the banks actually breached naturally. So all those little field compartments that you can see, you know, it was quite intensive farming before Steart. So you had a lot of arable, some big arable fields, lots of ryegrass lays, dairy farming, quite intense sheep grazing. But what you can see is with that inundation of tidal water, that farmland, obviously not ideal, was going to go down in quality and actually wouldn't be farmable. So this was obviously in 1981, and we know with sea level rise, we know with more tidal surges, storm occurrences, that this was going to be happening more and more. So it was actually, the farmers were actually all had agents working for them, and they actually were quite happy to sell the land at the time, and they got a good price for it. And the Environment Agency, being obviously a government body, have to be responsible with the taxpayers' money. So they have to look at sort of the cost benefit analysis. So they considered doing absolutely nothing, which would have been no good for obviously the landowners, and neither for there's 3 villages on the peninsula. That obviously wouldn't be ideal for them. Doing minimum, which would have just been maintaining the banks as they were, again, absolutely pointless, because this would have maintained as a risk. We did look at bringing water in for the Severn Estuary side, but the cost of putting a bridge in to keep the village of Steart connected was astronomical. So it was decided that we bring the water in from the River Parrett, and that was the final design. So next slide, please, Ellie. So I'd just like to put this in there because one of my first questions when I started, in fact, one of my first questions when I had my interview on the site was, how do you go around designing a site on this scale? So it's 488 hectares. It's one of the biggest habitat creation schemes in Europe. And so first and foremost, we use something called LiDAR, which I'm sure many of you are well aware of. So we use the natural lay of the land. So the top left picture, you can see the red areas are where you have your higher land, which is where you have your villages. We've got the oranges and the yellows, which is where all the most of the arable and farm fields were. And then those dark blue areas, this is where we, in the design of the wetland, that's where we decide to flood in the winter or create our saline lagoons. So what you're doing is you're working with the land. There's no pumping. You're working with what you've got, which means it's much more resilient and obviously sustainable to run as well. We then had to consider what you've already got on the ground, bottom left picture. So this is why we've got sort of this shows 4 main areas. I'll explain the 4th very briefly. But we've got a high voltage power line coming from Hinckley that sort of dissects the site. That's the yellow line, and then that single track road leading us to the village is the red line. That sort of divided it again. So the red area is our main intertidal area. We've got the green area that's our regulated tidal exchange, and then the blue area is our freshwater marsh. The yellow area, that was going to be another habitat. Well, that was going to be a mitigation scheme connected with Avonmouth docks and the ports expanding, but unfortunately in 2009, when all the conversations started with Steart, the economy crashed and they lost their investor. They have, however, they've bought the options on the land. So that is something that will be happening at some time in the future. So there is still a risk of flooding from the Severn side. So that remains a risk for the farmland and the villages at the moment. And then on the right, that's just showing what the engineers do brilliantly. So they use CAD. They design it all on a computer, and then they speak to the vehicles on the site and they just copy it perfectly. So the whole site is cut and fill. So the creek that you can see here, that's where we got the material for the flood banks. So you get what you need from the land itself. Next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. So yeah, the completed scheme, Steart Marshes. So we opened to the public in February 2014. So obviously massive changes, as you can imagine. That was all little you had all your field boundaries with ditches and hedges. So there was a lot of, you know, had to be a lot of works for European protected species. We had to divert footpaths, all sorts of things. But what we have got is those three main areas that I explained. We've got Steart Marshes, which Steart Marsh itself, which is the coastal marsh. This is open to the tide all of the time. It did inundate about 120 times a year, sort of spill out over the creek, but the accretion has been so much that it's more about 13 times a year now. So it's doing what it should do. It's accreting and establishing salt marsh vegetation, upper salt marsh vegetation. We've got a regulated tidal exchange area, Otterhampton Marsh. This is first by far the most productive part of the site in terms of birds and invertebrates as well, actually. So we've got our saline lagoons, really, really rare habitat. It's where we get most of our wintering birds and a lot of our breeding birds as well. And then we've got our freshwater marsh as well. So what's really lovely is you've got the freshwater marsh, which sort of brings in the fresh water from the catchment itself, and then it feeds through all these different habitats. So what is brilliant about Steart is you've got this huge diversity of habitats and everything in between. And I think we all know that diversity gives us sustainability and the resilience to climate change that we need. But we've also got really fantastic management of the water itself. So we're able to, you can sort of see the blue channel in Stockland Marshes, we're able to actually win water right from the beginning of the scheme. And we're separate to any of the surrounding farmland or properties, so we can keep our levels much, much higher than farmers may want to do. And that allows us to create sort of freshwater ponds, a big lake, and bringing it all through the area and use it as and when we wish. And what we've got now is fantastic local amenities. We've got 10 kilometres of new footpath. We've got 4 hides. We've got DDA compliant hides, bridleways, cycleways. So it's a huge change and really been embraced by the local community. And the reserve management itself. So we've got 5 members of staff on site. There's myself as the site manager. We've got the wardens who do all the amazing practical work. And then we've got over 60 volunteers now, and without them we wouldn't be able to look after Steart as we do. So that obviously helps with practical work, engagement and surveying. So that's a really big part of what Steart is about, and that's where it really comes to life, really, is the monitoring and the research. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that, and that's how we get the data. Next slide please, Ellie. So before I go into sort of how the site's being used for sort of benefits for people and things, I'd just like to show this photo as well. So this shows the breach. So when we first opened, so when we first cut that hole in the parrot wall, you can see here sort of is about 2 meters deep, the outfall, and then in 2020 it's now sort of about 12 meters deep. What's really good though is that central channel. It is behaving as an estuarine habitat. So we're seeing in the spring and the summer, we're seeing buildup of silts and moving around. And then in the sort of more aggressive, the autumn and the winter, we're seeing sort of things being eroded and the mud being deposited and shifted around site. So really, really dynamic and exciting part of the site. But it's actually reached more sort of equilibrium now. So we've been getting that monitored by LiDAR, and they're happy that it's behaving as it should. Next slide please, Ellie. So working wetlands, the sort of benefits to people. So this has been my my lifeblood really since becoming the site manager. It was how to communicate these messages and getting these messages across to people. So we know now, you know, it goes without saying, it protects local properties from flooding. We're actually able to store floodwaters, so we work really closely with the Internal Drainage Board and the Environment Agency, because obviously it's their site as well. And because we've got such acute management of the water, what we can do is, typically you always get high tides with high rainfall. So when you want to lose the water, you can't, because you've got things that are tide locked. So we can actually preempt these sorts of things, and we can increase the capacity in our freshwater marsh by drawing levels down. And then the IDB will actually divert floodwaters into the site itself and hold water for longer. So it's all about slowing the flow and just giving the system time until the tide drops again. We've also improved a lot of the ditches. So a lot of the ditches were long, straight and tall, which is sort of typical you get on the Somerset levels and moors, of course. But what we have done is, where possible, is we've actually, it's meandering, we've made them much wider, and we've put in berms as well. So it's not only better for wildlife, it actually, increases the capacity of those ditches massively. So there's less risk of those overtopping. And then there's a brilliant, if you have time on YouTube, there's a brilliant video on YouTube that shows how salt marsh protects, it actually absorbs wave energy. So in that protection, it actually protects the flood defense itself. So we haven't gone, the fantastic thing about our flood bank is a lot of people, it used to be concrete, really expensive to maintain. Ours is obviously soil. We've sown it with a grass mix, so it's actually an asset for the farmer. So it's a hay meadow as well as being an asset as a flood defense. So it could potentially get eroded away with sort of wave action and things. So it's a really important part of what the salt marsh does. Next slide, please, Ellie. So that was the sort of risk reduction side of things for people, but there's also the natural wealth. So everybody, I think it's all being talked about now, isn't it? Natural capital and the value in the wildlife itself. I think a lot of, well, I know a lot of people I worked with struggled with it initially, because you think that the wildlife is a benefit enough and that should be enough for people. But I think we all know, if we want to bring around change, if we want to make government sort of prick up their ears, it needs to make economic sense to create more wetlands or more habitats. So the farmers, it's still farmed. So that's one of my key messages, because a lot of people think that can sometimes think you've taken agricultural land and flooded it and ruined really highly productive farmland. So we've still got some of those farmers are still grazing the land now. So instead of it being intensive farming, it's obviously conservation farming. So we're in a higher level stewardship agreement that dictates, how many cattle we can have on there. It dictates when we can do the hay cut, but we are being productive. So salt marsh lamb, salt marsh beef. And what the farmers found is they're coming off the salt marsh flat backed, so they're not even needing fattening up afterwards. And the salt marsh is like a natural wormer, so there's less input as well. So it's a nicer lifestyle for the animals and less stressful for the farmer. So that's really, really good. We're doing a huge amount on health and well-being and social prescribing. So we're working with sorts of different charities and mental health people, and also doctors, about getting people outside and enjoying wetlands and doing activities. Trying to get quantitative data for that is really challenging, but we're even looking at brainwaves and things. So they're doing a lot at Steart and a lot in London at the moment. And actually that's where COVID helped us a lot, because a lot of people understand what health and well-being means now. I'm not sure they did beforehand. Improve water quality, so that's a really key benefit. So we know, as the water goes through the wetland plants, it takes out phosphates, nitrates. In the slowing of the water, the roots themselves, the sediment drops out. So we measure our water quality all through the site, at the beginning of the system, at the end, to show evidence for this. But we've also got a treatment wetland on site, so that deals with all of our liquids from our toilets. So again, it just shows people what wetlands can do in terms of benefits. You've obviously got the sea bass, the fishery side of things. So the specialized plants actually enable the smaller, like the fry of those fish, to sort of hide away from predators. And then, of course, where Steart's really come up in the news a lot recently is it locks in huge amounts of carbon. So I will be talking all about that in a little bit more detail now. Next slide, please, Ellie. So first and foremost, obviously, one of the benefits it's providing is habitat creation, and providing a place for the wildlife to be. So we measure that all the time. So we do surveys on site for three main reasons. One was to make sure that the site is delivering its objectives. So it's all well and good, the Environment Agency spending £20.7 million on a scheme to say that we're compensating for habitat that's being lost. But if you're not actually replacing the habitat that's being lost, then it's just sort of a bit of greenwashing. So the Environment Agency, they gave us a budget for sort of monitoring, and we needed to make sure that the salt marsh habitat was establishing, and also that the wintering birds were using it. And as you can see here, you know, we got 16 key salt marsh species. We had our first sea lavender in 2019, which was actually massively exciting because it notoriously doesn't establish in man-made salt marshes. So that was a real biggie. Our national vegetation classification surveys are showing that it's going from that sort of freshwater, sort of all intensely sort of ryegrass fields to sort of salt marsh communities, which is really, really good. And then our wintering birds, you know, they're going up and up each year. 10 species of those already exceeding sort of national importance thresholds, and a few highlights being sort of 7,500 dunlin, 6,500 lapwing, and over 1,000 teal in the winter. And we get huge flocks of avocet now as well around the breach. So that's been really exciting. Next slide, please, Ellie. So another reason that we survey the site is obviously, as a site manager, I need to make sure that I'm not making decisions that are detrimental to the wildlife that needs to use the site. So on an annual basis, we have a butterfly transect set up. We have dragonflies transect set up. We were lucky enough to have Dave Smallshire and Andy Swash actually come to site for 2 years in a row to come and do some surveys and help us set those up. And that's how the site now reserves merit as recognition of a site of national importance for dragonflies. So that was really exciting, considering as it's only 9 years old. Invertebrates, so we're measuring those all the time in our ditches and our terrestrial invertebrates. We've got more bat species on site than we did pre-scheme. I was really interested to know if they'd use the creek system and things as they would a hedge. And we have found that sort of there's a real distinction between each site and the species that use them. So the bigger sort of species, like the more open exposed site. So it's fantastic that they're still using it. And eels is a real biggie. We know that they're massively endangered and need all the help they can get. So we get eels of every life stage on site. So we get the glass eels coming in straight from the sea. We then get the elvers mooching about, the yellow eels, sort of like our freshwater marsh. And then we get our silver eels in sort of the deeper ponds and things. So that's really positive. Next slide, please, Ellie. So breeding birds, this is just a very quick slide, but it just shows a lot of these species would not have been breeding there before. So our sort of golden grails are the skylark. So people come to Steart and people still feel really nostalgic when they hear skylark singing. And that goes back to that flood bank that I mentioned before. You know, if it was hard concrete, you wouldn't have got that. So majority of our skylark are nesting on that natural flood bank, natural flood management. So they're going up each year. And avocet, so there were no avocet breeding in Somerset for 150 years. And then we created Steart, and we had over 45 pairs this summer. And that's majority of which are in our sort of the regulated tidal exchange area where our saline lagoons are. And it just shows that it's working, really. So next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. And the other reason we do research and surveys is, you know, you also need to share maybe mistakes that were made or lessons learned. So we think it's important to look at, to be able to help others look at the best way of designing their sites so the right habitat establishes as quickly as possible. So we had someone looking at the topography. So we found that actually varying the topography was far more important than the previous land use. So there was a lot of concern that with all the arable fields and the intensive farming, that the compact soil would have been detrimental to the establishment of the salt marsh habitat. It wasn't, which is brilliant. And also the creek network. So Steart was one of the first to have a creek network dug, mainly because of the size of it. You know, it's 3 kilometers long. It's a huge area. The salt marsh area itself is 260 hectares. but there's a cost to that. So construction workers and the engineers want to know if it's worth investing in putting in artificial creeks, and they found that it has. And at the end of those creeks, what we have found is also fairing the topography where we put in extra islands and things, is that you're actually getting those proto creeks, those secondary creeks sort of forming. So it's, yeah, well worth it. Next slide, please, Ellie. So the sort of real big reason that we do a lot of our research, and where Steart has really come into its own as a demonstration site, is ecosystem services, natural wealth of wetland habitat. So the three main key ones currently, we've had a PhD study undertaken looking at the fish habitat of man-made salt marshes. So he was particularly looking at sea bass fry, which you can see in the bottom right here, because there is a benefit there to fisheries economically. So we have found that they do come in and they ride on the tides. That's fantastic. I've mentioned the health and well-being side of things, so we're now trying to quantify that, and we're doing a lot of work with that. We had some extra money with the Green Recovery Fund, which was brilliant, but the real biggie is the carbon storage. So if you go to the next slide, Ellie, I'll explain a bit more about that. So the natural wealth of blue carbon. So the biggie that why carbon is important is it helps regulate our climate, but it also with our nutrient cycling as well. And it's worth noting that sort of 50 to 90% of all coastal wetland carbon is found in the soil itself. Next slide, please, Ellie. So why are salt marshes good at storing carbon? So this is something that WWT have, it's not necessarily an easy message to get across, but this sort of shows the different tide stages. And so we have new sediment is brought in on our sort of really big tides, and that's deposited, and that buries carbon in the mud itself, but also in the salt marsh plants, which actually store carbon through photosynthesis. The tidal inundation, that keeps the soil wet. So actually wetlands are one of the best habitats at storing carbon. Because of that wetness, there's less aerobic activity going on, and so there's less release of any gases. There's also the organic carbon, which is buried deeper and deeper each time the tide comes in. Next slide, please, Ellie. So we were lucky enough to work very closely with Manchester Metropolitan University, and they use LiDAR again. So they wanted to know how much sediment was accumulated, how much carbon was in that new sediment, and how dense it was, so they could scale it up. So they take cores, they scale it up by using the LiDAR. They can see how much is deposited year on year, and then they can just sort of, apply that to the entire site. So from that, we know that we've got 19 tons of carbon being stored per hectare per year. So in the 4-year study that this was undertaken, we know that we've got 18,000 tons of carbon. So this is obviously just one salt marsh, but the potential to scale up this habitat across the UK, across the world, is absolutely is exceptional. So the government are looking at creating 22,000 hectares of more salt marsh. So if you imagine how much carbon that would be, it's absolutely, it's astronomical, and definitely a major step to reaching our net zero targets by 2050. Next slide, please, Ellie. So this is where our guys are sitting in government. So it's a nature-based solution, it's a natural solution, and we're not against trees. I just like to say that very, very quickly, but what we are for is the right habitat in the right place. And also there is currently carbon offsetting codes for peatland and woodland, but there's still no policy for salt marsh, which is just mind-blowing really when you think of what it can deliver. So this is something that we're really, really pushing for. And you can see here some of the things that it's equivalent to. So we're just asking government to ensure that blue carbon habitats, including salt marsh, are included in climate change plans. And we're joining other forces, joining forces with other environmental organisations to call for this. So it's very much a sort of lobbying effort. Next slide, please, Ellie. So another, I think yeah, something that everyone else is doing now is the Steart Marshes itself delivering all those benefits, but you can't just keep those benefits within these sort of tight boundaries. We all know now that landscape scale conservation is the way forward. You know, John Lawton's report, Making Space for Nature, stated that we needed more wildlife sites, and they need to be bigger and better managed and joined together. So this is some of the different projects that WWT are working on. We're going to be taking on Bridgewater Bay NNR, which is next door to us, in January officially. We're working on the Huntsville, doing work in Bridgewater itself, so wetland, sort of urban wetland side of things, and projects in Willerton, which was protecting villages from flooding. So loads of things going on. Next slide, please, Ellie. And then we became an NNR this year. So again, this is more of the joined up, connecting, making those wetlands more valuable. We're just at the very start of our super NNR, but you can see the sort of the dark green is the main NNRs in Somerset. So now we're looking at nature recovery networks, all those sorts of things, to sort of means that all those benefits will be much more resilient and will be more connected. So I believe final slide, please, Ellie. It's my discrete timer just going off there. So we were 75 years old last year, and we are a leading international conservation charity, like I say, creating, restoring and managing wetlands. And what we want is a world where healthy wetland nature thrives and enriches lives. You can't just create wetlands, and they have to be healthy as well. And, you know, there's a lot of negativity out there, and with all the sort of the nature crisis, the climate crisis, the mental health crisis, we just think there's never been a more vital time to increase healthy wetlands throughout the world. So that is why we're sort of banging the benefits that wetlands bring drum to people, and hoping to sort of bring around some of those changes in policy. So that's it in sort of a nutshell. Unfortunately, I said to Ellie, I'm unable to stay for the Q&A, but if anybody has any specific questions for me, please email me directly or pass it on from Ellie. But yeah, probably email me directly would probably be preferential for Ellie. And that's it. Thank you.